Hey guys, tonight we slip past the guarded doors of palaces and castles, stepping lightly across cold stone floors that echo with secrets. The air is heavy with incense and candle smoke, with whispers that seem to cling to tapestries and hang in the velvet folds of canopies. You're about to discover how the soft creak of a bed frame could carry more weight than an army's march, how the flutter of forbidden affection could topple crowns. And yes, you probably wouldn't have survived one of these scandals yourself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the threshold of royal beds where affairs were not just personal follies but geopolitical earthquakes. A king's sigh in the wrong chamber, a queen's glance toward the wrong courtier could ripple into wars that devoured thousands. Monarchs might rule nations, but they were ruled in turn by their hearts and sometimes by sheer impulse. Picture yourself in a medieval castle. The walls are damp, the air faintly smells of beeswax, and in a nearby hall minstrels strum lazy chords while nobles gossip. In such spaces, alliances were built not only through treaties but through embraces behind arras curtains. It was dangerous theatre. A king might risk everything for a mistress's smile, while a queen's clandestine affair could make every nobleman eye the throne suspiciously. Historians still argue whether the role of royal mistresses gave women unique power or merely left kingdoms unstable. What's undeniable is that countless whispered trysts dictated who would inherit crowns, who would go to war, and which dynasties would falter. You might chuckle now, imagining a powerful monarch undone not by an invading army, but by a love letter accidentally discovered under a pillow. Yet time and again it was exactly that sort of secret that sparked conspiracies. There's a quirky tidbit here. In 16th century France, professional bedchamber spies were paid to monitor who entered and left royal bedrooms, as though the nation's security depended on counting slippers by the door. Step closer to the tapestries, you notice threads depicting saints and battles, but beneath them lie the real wars, the forbidden affairs that re-sculpted maps and toppled dynasties. These chambers were both sanctuaries and snares, filled with silk sheets and sharp daggers of gossip. As you listen, let yourself drift into that tension. Candlelight flickers, the scent of rosewater hangs in the air, and just beyond the curtains, history waits, shaped by passions that dared not be spoken aloud. Ever wondered how a single glance across a banquet hall could ripple across continents? You find yourself now in Alexandria, the Egyptian city that once glittered like a crown jewel of the Mediterranean. The harbour bustles outside with sails and shouts, but within the palace the atmosphere is hushed, perfumed with frankincense and tense with intrigue.
Cleopatra's Seven walks the halls with deliberate grace, her eyes sharper than any soldier's sword, her perfume calculated to linger like a promise. Cleopatra's forbidden affairs weren't just whispers behind silk curtains, they were international policy. When Julius Caesar first arrived in Egypt, drawn by politics and debt collection, he didn't expect to be enchanted. Yet Cleopatra staged her entrance like theatre, rolled dramatically into the palace inside a rug. Imagine yourself unrolling that rug, no, not a dusty old carpet, but a silken bundle that spills out the most dangerous woman of her age. You might laugh at the drama, but historians still argue whether this was seduction, political genius, or both. The result? An affair that bound Rome's power to Egypt's throne. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, a child whose existence rattled Rome's political order. Forbidden? Absolutely. Roman law frowned upon foreign queens wielding influence, and senators whispered that Caesar might crown himself king beside Cleopatra. You could say that the future of the Republic trembled not on battlefields, but on the soft cushions of Cleopatra's private chambers. Then came Mark Antony. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra played her hand again, this time with a man who was both general and hopeless romantic. Their affair was legendary, filled with feasts where tables sagged under roasted peacocks and wine flowed like rivers. There's a quirky tidbit. Antony supposedly dressed as Dionysus, god of wine, while Cleopatra styled herself as Isis, goddess of love and magic, hosting banquets that blurred divinity and desire. It sounds absurdly theatrical, but such pageantry tightened their bond and terrified Rome. Historians still debate whether Antony truly loved Cleopatra or whether he was ensnared by her wealth and charisma. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, wrapped in silks and sealed with letters that senators in Rome gnashed their teeth over. What's certain is that their forbidden passion fractured the fragile alliance of the Roman triumvirs. You can almost hear the gossip echo through marble corridors in Rome. "Antony has abandoned us for that foreign witch." The Senate fumed. Octavian sharpened his propaganda, and suddenly an affair became a casus belli. The Battle of Actium wasn't just about ships and strategy, it was the climax of a forbidden romance that threatened an empire. Picture the torchlit decks, waves hissing against hulls, and above it all the knowledge that this wasn't simply war, it was the fallout of love turned scandalous. And when Octavian triumphed, Antony and Cleopatra retreated into their tragic finale, a story etched in snakebite legends and Shakespearean lines. So here's the reality check. The Roman Republic didn't collapse just because of politics or economics. It trembled because two lovers dared to mix passion with power, reminding you that sometimes the greatest empires crumble not with a roar, but with a kiss behind a curtain. You might not expect this, but sometimes an entire country's religious identity can hinge on one man's inability to keep his affections tidy. Step with me now into the draughty halls of Tudor England, where torches flicker against damp stone walls and courtiers shuffle nervously, waiting for a royal decision that might shatter their lives. At the centre of it all, Henry VIII, a man with a crown heavy on his head and desires heavier still in his heart. Henry wasn't the first monarch to stray, but he may have been the loudest about it. His forbidden affairs and desperate search for love, or perhaps just an heir, ended up tearing England away from the Catholic Church. Imagine this. You're a courtier lingering outside the king's chambers. Inside, muffled laughter drifts from behind the oak door, and you realize the king's attention is once again not on his lawful wife, Catherine of Aragon. You'd probably adjust your doublet and try not to smirk, but deep down you'd know the kingdom was tilting toward chaos. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn, a woman who first resisted his advances, directly led to the English Reformation. Desiring to marry her, Henry petitioned the Pope for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. When Rome refused, Henry thundered back with a solution only a monarch of his caliber and ego would dare break from the Catholic Church entirely. Thus the Church of England was born because of one forbidden affair. And here's the quirky tidbit. Anne Boleyn supposedly kept Henry waiting for nearly 7 years, refusing to be just another mistress. Historians still argue whether she truly loved him or whether she was playing the most dangerous game of political chess in Tudor history. One misstep meant ruin, one kiss meant coronation. Henry's pattern didn't stop there. Affairs, betrayals, and marriages piled up until the man had 6 wives, 2 executed, and one kingdom that no longer looked to Rome. You could almost call his marital history a tragic shopping list. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. A grim nursery rhyme for a king who couldn't separate his personal desires from state affairs. But imagine the candle-lit gossip at court, ladies-in-waiting whispering in alcoves, ambassadors reporting scandalous details back to their homelands, and commoners murmuring about the king's wandering heart. For them, the king's affairs weren't abstract. They dictated wars, taxes, and even whether attending Mass was a mortal sin or not. If you lean closer, you can almost hear Henry himself, pacing before a fire, muttering about heirs, love, and betrayal. His sighs, his tempers, his passionate letters to Anne, all of them reshaped the spiritual map of Europe. And it all began with a forbidden glance across a glittering Tudor hall. So next time you hear someone say religion and politics shaped the modern world, remember, sometimes it was really just one man, one woman, and a very messy love life that nudged history off its hinges. Ever wondered what happens when a dynasty so obsessed with order finds its stability threatened not by invading armies, but by affairs whispered in candlelit corners? You're now stepping into the world of the Habsburgs, a family tree that stretched like an oak across Europe, its branches entwined with marriages designed to cement empires. Yet behind those carefully brokered unions, secrets rustled like dry leaves, carrying the weight of forbidden desire. The Habsburgs were notorious for their rigid dynastic marriages. Cousins married cousins, crowns were exchanged like chess pieces, and alliances were sealed with vows spoken beneath golden cathedral arches. But while the official story was of perfect unions, the unofficial story was far messier. Picture Vienna's Hofburg Palace, marble corridors echoing with boots, courtiers bowing low, but in the quiet chambers, liaisons bloomed that could crack the empire's delicate balance. Here's the historical fact. The Habsburg dynasty survived for centuries, largely because of marriage diplomacy. "Let others wage war, you lucky Austria marry," became their motto. But those arranged unions often lacked affection, and forbidden affairs slipped in like drafts through a half-closed window. A quirky tidbit: Habsburg courtiers developed elaborate fan signals, yes, handheld fans, to disguise romantic communications. A flick to the left meant, "meet me after Vespers," while a tap against the palm could signal, "danger, someone's watching." Historians still argue whether these codes were taken seriously, or whether it was just playful court theatrics. Either way, fans became as sharp as daggers in the theatre of secrecy. The stakes, however, weren't playful. An affair involving a royal spouse or influential noble could mean entire provinces rising in rebellion. Imagine being a peasant in Hungary, hearing that the emperor's wife had strayed. Suddenly, whispers grew that perhaps the empire itself was weak, its divine authority shaken. Enemies at the borders would sense blood in the water, while ambitious nobles sharpened their daggers and polished their coats, ready to claim influence through scandal. Some affairs remained rumors, others erupted into scandals that spread across courts from Madrid to Prague. A princess caught in compromise might be shipped off quietly to a convent, her future sealed behind cold stone walls. A prince entangled with a noblewoman could spark duels and vendettas that echoed for decades. Imagine yourself leaning against a palace balcony, hearing the hush of court musicians below and the rustle of skirts behind a half-closed door. The empire itself feels brittle in that moment, as though one kiss could undo centuries of careful planning. And in some cases it did. Alliances dissolved, inheritances disputed, crowns toppled because someone's heart strayed outside dynastic duty. So while textbooks might focus on treaties and battles, remember that the mighty Habsburg Empire sometimes teetered on the edges of its own bedchambers, where affairs were both deeply human and dangerously political. Behind the rigid facade of dynasty, the whispers of love and betrayal hummed like a hidden song, threatening to undo the empire's carefully woven harmony. You might expect an emperor to keep his heart neatly aligned with his empire, but Napoleon Bonaparte proved otherwise. Tonight you wander through the long, echoing galleries of the Tuileries Palace, where mirrors gleam in candlelight and shadows flicker across crimson drapes. In those chambers, behind closed doors, Napoleon's private infidelities tugged against the public image of the man who once proclaimed himself master of Europe. Here's the historical fact. Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais in 1796, a widow with children whose charm captivated him entirely. His letters to her are embarrassingly passionate, sometimes to the point where you want to say, "Okay, maybe don't overshare, General." But Josephine was not faithful, and soon Napoleon wasn't either. While he campaigned across Europe, whispers of affairs filled the salons of Paris. Historians still argue whether his need to match her infidelity was personal spite or simply imperial entitlement. The quirky tidbit? Napoleon once sent Josephine a letter saying he would arrive home in 3 days, urging her not to bathe before then so he could enjoy her natural scent. Romantic or revolting, you decide. Either way, such letters later circulated as evidence of a ruler whose private obsessions contrasted sharply with his public persona of discipline. But these were more than embarrassing side stories. Napoleon's need for an heir became urgent. Josephine couldn't give him one, so he annulled their marriage, heartbroken but politically practical, and married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise. That union was meant to seal peace with the Habsburgs, yet rumours of continued affairs on both sides undermined the picture of dynastic stability. A single whisper in Vienna or Paris could shake confidence in treaties meant to secure all of Europe. Now imagine yourself strolling through the palace gardens at dusk. Beyond the fountains and clipped hedges, you hear a hushed laugh from the shadows, an officer too close to the Empress, a chambermaid boasting of gifts. In such moments, Napoleon's carefully polished myth cracked. Soldiers who once revered him whispered about a man ruled not just by strategy, but by desire. And the scandals multiplied. When he was exiled to Elba after his first abdication, Josephine had already died, but people whispered that Napoleon never truly let her memory go. He carried portraits of her, even as he returned to France for his famous 100 Days. A general who bent the map of Europe could not quite escape the pull of forbidden loves. Historians still debate, did Napoleon's personal affairs weaken his political alliances, or were they simply symptoms of a man who believed normal rules didn't apply to him? Either way, imagine a soldier at Waterloo wiping rain from his eyes, muttering that perhaps the emperor's downfall began not on the battlefield, but in the bedroom. So when you think of Napoleon, short stature jokes aside, remember him not only as the military genius who crowned himself emperor, but also as a man whose heart wandered, whose affairs eroded his legend, and whose personal choices rippled outward until Europe itself shuddered. You might think palace scandals were just harmless whispers over wine, but in Madrid during the Spanish Golden Age, forbidden affairs could ignite political purges with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. Tonight you drift into the shadowed corridors of the Alcázar of Madrid, the royal palace that once stood before fire, consumed it in the 18th century. The walls are hung with dark Flemish tapestries, the smell of roasted chestnuts wafts faintly from kitchens below, and in the air hangs something more dangerous than smoke: rumour. The Spanish court under the Habsburgs and later the Bourbons was notoriously stiff, its etiquette crushingly formal. You could practically sprain an ankle just bowing correctly. Yet beneath all that rigid ceremony, passions burned hotter than the Castilian sun. Forbidden affairs bloomed in secret gardens, in candlelit oratories, and occasionally in the dangerous space between a king's trust and a noble's ambition. Here's the historical fact. Philip IV of Spain fathered an astonishing number of illegitimate children. Some historians estimate more than 30, earning him both the admiration of libertines and the headache of political instability. Those affairs weren't just private diversions. Each illegitimate child was a potential pawn, a reminder to legitimate heirs that succession was never entirely secure. Now for the quirky tidbit, the Count Duke of Olivares, Philip's all-powerful minister, supposedly kept meticulous records of the king's lovers, partly to protect him, partly to control him. Imagine the awkwardness of having your prime minister act as both your wingman and your warden. But here's the danger. Every affair gave rivals leverage. A noblewoman favoured by the king could raise her family's influence overnight, sparking jealousy and conspiracies. The Spanish Inquisition itself was sometimes nudged into investigating cases of immorality that just happened to involve inconvenient political enemies. Historians still argue whether these inquisitorial trials were genuine religious crackdowns or thinly veiled revenge for whispered affairs. Picture yourself at a royal masque in Madrid. Masks glitter with jewels, music swells, and fans flutter nervously. Behind one mask, a queen's lady-in-waiting exchanges a glance with a powerful duke. Is it love or treason wrapped in silk? The line was perilously thin. One affair in particular nearly tore the court apart. Rumours about Queen Elizabeth of France, Philip IV's consort, and the poet Duke Carlos de Olivares. Yes, nephew of the minister. Whether the whispers were true remains uncertain, but the scandal was enough to create factions that destabilized Madrid's already fragile politics. Even a rumor could topple a favorite, exile a noble, or spark riots in the streets. You can almost hear the hushed conversations in palace alcoves, the scrape of boots in corridors as guards hurry to lock down the palace after yet another accusation. In this world, gossip was a weapon, and a kiss could become a coup. So when you think of Spain's decline from golden empire to struggling monarchy, don't just picture silver fleets and bankrupt treasuries. Remember too the hidden affairs, the dangerous glances, the jealous whispers that gnawed away at the foundations of royal authority until the palace itself seemed to tremble with every secret. You might not expect a palace built on gold and marble to echo more loudly with gossip than with prayers, but Versailles was exactly that. Step into the glittering halls of Louis XIV's palace, where mirrors multiply candlelight into infinity, and the air smells faintly of wax, roses, and ambition. Versailles was supposed to be the jewel of absolutism, a place where every gesture of the Sun King reinforced divine order. Yet behind those gilded doors, affairs and mistresses waged silent wars that could change the course of Europe. Here's the historical fact. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had a long line of mistresses, both official and secret, who influenced politics as much as ministers did. His most famous maîtresse en titre, Madame de Montespan, practically ran the court during her reign as favourite. She received visitors, decided who got access to the king, and even whispered in his ear about policy. Not bad for someone who technically wasn't supposed to exist in the political hierarchy. A quirky tidbit? Madame de Montespan was implicated in the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal involving black magic, love potions, and alleged attempts to use sorcery to secure Louis's love. Historians still argue whether she truly dabbled in occult charms or whether jealous rivals smeared her name. Either way, the thought of the Sun King's mistress sneaking around with powdered toads and whispered incantations feels more Gothic horror novel than court record. Versailles itself was designed to trap nobles in glitter. They flocked there to compete for favours, yet they also competed for the king's heart. A smile, a dance, a late-night visit, these things could mean the difference between rising into wealth or falling into disgrace. Imagine yourself in the Hall of Mirrors during a masquerade. Masks sparkle, violins trill, and behind one reflection a secret meeting unfolds. A duke pressing a hand to a marchioness's wrist, praying no one notices. But people always noticed, and those whispers could turn deadly. Rival mistresses plotted against each other, slipping notes, bribing servants, and even turning to priests for confessions that might be leaked to the king. Affairs weren't just about love, they were power disguised as intimacy. Louis himself revelled in this dance, even as it threatened stability. His legitimate heirs watched resentfully, courtiers gnashed their teeth, and foreign ambassadors wrote dispatches not about troop movements, but about which lady had been seen entering the king's chambers. The fate of wars sometimes hinged less on soldiers than on bedchamber allegiances. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the blend of perfumes and secrets in those corridors, the rustle of silk skirts, the soft click of shoes on marble as someone steals into a hidden chamber. Versailles glittered, yes, but its golden glow was fueled by shadows of forbidden affairs. So while Louis XIV proclaimed "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, the truth is a bit softer, whispered in silk and candlelight. I am the state, but also the state is my mistress. Ever thought about how an empire as vast as Russia could hinge on rumours whispered in a candlelit bedroom? Tonight you drift through the opulent corridors of St. Petersburg's Winter Palace, where frost crusts the windows outside, but inside the air is heavy with velvet, fur, and perfumes imported from Paris. Here, Catherine II, better remembered as Catherine the Great, rules not only with decrees and armies, but with a heart that history insists on turning into scandal. The mainstream historical fact, Catherine the Great secured her throne in 1762 by overthrowing her husband Peter III with the backing of powerful nobles and the military. But once she wore the crown, whispers about her companions never stopped. Catherine had a succession of favourites, handsome officers, ambitious courtiers, cultured intellectuals, each of whom seemed to benefit from her affection with titles, estates, and sudden prominence. The quirky tidbit: Catherine reportedly issued her lovers a retirement package once the relationship ended, fine estates, serfs to manage them, and comfortable pensions. Imagine being handed a castle as consolation for a breakup. Courtiers joked that being Catherine's favourite was the fastest road to fortune, until it wasn't. Historians still argue whether she used these relationships strategically to keep nobles loyal, or whether she simply enjoyed surrounding herself with youthful energy. Picture yourself in her private chambers. The walls are draped in damask golden light pools from candelabra, and a chessboard sits mid-game, waiting. A favoured officer lingers too close to the Empress's chair, his boots polished, his voice lowered. Outside, guards stand stiff, pretending not to notice. Inside, an empire trembles with possibility. One affair could make a family powerful overnight, while another dismissal could exile them to Siberia. The stakes were enormous. Every new companion meant a shift in alliances. Foreign ambassadors wrote home obsessively about Catherine's supposed romances, trying to gauge Russia's direction through the tilt of her affections. If her lover leaned pro-French, would Russia tilt west? If he favoured expansion, would armies march south? A candle-lit embrace became a kind of diplomatic weather vane, and yet Catherine herself was no naive queen undone by passion. She governed with reforms, corresponded with Voltaire, modernized the empire, and expanded Russia's borders until they sprawled across 3 continents. Still, the gossip never ceased. Centuries later, salacious rumors, some invented by her enemies, cling to her legacy like frost that never melts. You can almost hear her sighing as she leans over a map, quill scratching borders while courtiers outside trade jokes about who warmed her bed. It's a reminder that power is never immune to scandal, and that even the greatest empress in Europe could be reduced by her rivals to whispers in candlelight. So when you think of Catherine the Great, let yourself drift between the grandeur of empire and the intimacy of her private chambers, where affairs were not just passion, but policy, and where love and power were stitched together in silk and secrecy. You might not expect a queen's heart to become a battlefield, but Mary, Queen of Scots, lived a life where every whispered romance turned into open rebellion. Tonight you find yourself in the damp stone chambers of Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, where torches sputter in sconces and the scent of smoke clings to heavy wool tapestries. The wind outside howls across the Scottish moors, but inside it's not the weather that chills, it's intrigue. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Mary married 3 times, and each union was tangled in political scandal. Her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, turned from charming consort to arrogant liability almost overnight. When Darnley was mysteriously murdered in 1567, his body discovered in a garden after an explosion, suspicion swirled around Mary and her close confidant, the Earl of Bothwell. Historians still argue whether Mary conspired in the murder or whether she was a pawn in a larger plot. The quirky tidbit: after Darnley's death, Bothwell allegedly abducted Mary, though some whispered she was a willing participant, and married her in a scandal that made even hardened nobles gasp. Imagine a royal wedding where half the guests muttered, "This feels like a crime scene." The affair between Mary and Bothwell, whether real or exaggerated, cracked her fragile legitimacy and gave her enemies exactly the ammunition they needed. Picture yourself among her ladies-in-waiting, huddled in candlelight as rumours ripple through the corridors. The Queen has betrayed her people. She has married the murderer of her husband. Outside, mobs murmur, nobles sharpen their blades, and the scent of rebellion hangs thicker than the peat smoke. Mary's private choices had become public outrage, and Scotland trembled. Her cousin, Elizabeth the Suffers of England, watched closely. Every affair, every whisper about Mary's heart, made her a dangerous rival for England's throne. When Mary fled into Elizabeth's arms for protection, she became a prisoner instead, her reputation already shredded by scandal. Eventually, she was executed after being implicated in plots against Elizabeth. Yet even in death, Mary's affairs remained the subject of debate, sung in ballads and scribbled in chronicles. Historians still argue whether Mary was reckless in love or simply trapped in a brutal game where her heart became a weapon used against her. But in either case, her story reminds you that a queen's passion could topple not only her own crown, but an entire nation's stability. So as you sit in those dim Scottish halls, listening to the echo of boots on stone and the rustle of skirts behind doors, remember Mary, a queen undone not by foreign armies, but by the forbidden affairs that entangled her destiny like ivy around crumbling castle walls. Ever wondered what it felt like to walk the marbled halls of Constantinople, knowing that one wrong embrace could bring down a dynasty? Tonight you wander into the Byzantine palaces where mosaics shimmer with gold, candles drip wax onto cool stone floors, and the salty breeze of the Bosporus slips through arched windows. Behind those jewel-encrusted walls, forbidden affairs could shatter more than hearts. They could unravel empires. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian the First in the 6th century, rose from humble origins. Some claimed she was once an actress, others whispered of courtesan work. While her official reign was one of partnership and formidable influence, enemies at court never stopped spinning rumors of secret lovers. Historians still argue whether Theodora truly had forbidden affairs during her reign, or whether these were slanders meant to discredit a powerful woman who dared to share the emperor's authority. But centuries later, another empress, Zoe Porphyrogenita, offered a more vivid story. She married 3 emperors in succession, and her passions were no less famous than her purple robes. Her second marriage to Michael IV was clouded by whispers of prior affairs, and when she favoured handsome courtiers a little too openly, palace intrigue surged like floodwaters. Picture yourself as a servant balancing a tray of figs, overhearing murmurs, "The empress's heart has strayed again." One tray dropped in shock, and suddenly you're part of history. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Byzantine court actually employed eunuch guardians, not only to manage palace administration, but also to patrol bedchamber propriety. A eunuch might stand outside an empress's door, noting who came and went like a bureaucrat with a gossip column. Imagine filing that paperwork. But affairs weren't only whispered, they were weapons. Enemies of the throne spread tales of adulterous empresses to undermine legitimacy. When Zoe was accused of affairs, riots erupted in Constantinople, with citizens demanding she be restored to power after one of her husbands tried to sideline her. Love, scandal, and politics braided together until the streets themselves burned. You can almost hear the clamour, the clash of bronze shields outside the hippodrome, chants rising from furious mobs, and in the palace, Zoe clutching her jewels, her fate swinging on whether the people believed her guilty of betrayal or merely the victim of slander. Historians still argue whether these Byzantine empresses truly indulged in forbidden romances or whether their enemies weaponized rumor. What is certain is that a single whisper about love could ripple outward, shaking not just a throne but the very city that called itself the New Rome. So let yourself drift here, marble floors cool beneath your feet, incense curling through domed ceilings and behind silken curtains, history humming with the sound of affairs, whether real or imagined, that almost toppled the Byzantine world. You might not expect sibling rivalry to involve whispers of forbidden romance, but the Tudor sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, lived in courts where every glance could spark suspicion and every rumour could breed rebellion. Tonight you step into the candlelit chambers of Greenwich Palace, where the rushes on the floor crunch underfoot, courtiers bow stiffly and shadows cling to carved oak beams. The air is thick, not only with smoke and perfume, but with tension, because the sisters of Henry VIII carried both crowns and scandals in their blood. The mainstream historical fact, Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, was married off to Louis V of France. He was decades older, and the marriage was clearly political. Yet Mary soon shocked Europe by secretly marrying Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, a man the king had not approved. It was forbidden love in its boldest form, royalty defying the very monarch who defined obedience. The scandal nearly destroyed Brandon's career and could have fractured Anglo-French diplomacy. Only Henry's begrudging forgiveness, sweetened by hefty fines, saved them. The quirky tidbit? Mary's ladies-in-waiting smuggled secret letters during her French marriage, warning Brandon of her unhappiness and plotting their clandestine union. Historians still argue whether Henry forgave them out of brotherly affection or sheer exhaustion at trying to control everyone's romantic impulses. Elizabeth I, Mary's niece, lived differently, but not without whispers. Known as the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth officially married no one, but her long and suspiciously close relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, set tongues wagging. Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, conveniently died from a fall down a staircase, an event that still fuels debate. Was it accident, suicide, or murder? Historians still argue, and Elizabeth's silence only deepened the scandal. Picture yourself in her court, musicians plucking lutes, courtiers watching Elizabeth's every move, and in one corner, Dudley kneeling a little too close, his voice pitched softer than protocol required. Outside, foreign ambassadors wrote frantically to their masters, "The Queen is undone by love!" Inside, Elizabeth maintained her enigmatic smile, leaving everyone guessing. The danger lay in perception. For Mary, open defiance nearly cost her everything. For Elizabeth, even the hint of an affair could shatter the image of a sovereign untouchable by male control. Both women danced on knives, proving that forbidden love was as perilous as open rebellion. You can almost hear the whispers around the court. Did you see the Queen's glance? Has he stayed too long in her chambers? In the Tudor world, romance was never private. It was a public gamble that could tilt crowns and spark wars. So remember the sisters, Mary, who risked everything for love, and Elizabeth, who risked everything by withholding it. Between them, forbidden affairs, whether real, rumoured, or rejected, reshaped the destiny of England itself. You might imagine French queens floating serenely through gilded halls, their crowns steady on their heads, but in truth they often balanced on knives, their reputations one scandal away from collapse. Tonight, you wander into the Louvre in its earlier days, before Versailles stole the spotlight, where flickering torches reflect off stone walls and courtiers murmur behind lace fans. In France, a queen's honour was never fully her own. It was a political currency, vulnerable to every whisper of forbidden passion. The mainstream historical fact in the 16th century, Queen Marguerite de Valois, immortalized as Queen Margot, was notorious for alleged affairs that scandalized her marriage to Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV. Their union was meant to heal religious divisions between Catholics and Protestants, but instead became a powder keg. Her supposed lovers gave Catholic factions ammunition to paint her as immoral, undermining the fragile political peace. A quirky tidbit? Marguerite was once accused of sneaking lovers into her chambers hidden in laundry baskets. Whether truth or slander, the image of a queen's secret passion stuffed between sheets was enough to ignite Parisian gossip like dry tinder. Historians still argue whether Marguerite's reputation was deserved or the invention of enemies who feared a clever, outspoken woman. Another infamous case, Marie Antoinette, centuries later, became the victim of the diamond necklace affair, where pamphlets accused her of purchasing an extravagant necklace through a lover's influence. She hadn't, but the rumour of an affair paired with extravagance was enough to ruin her already fragile popularity. You can almost hear the smug laughter of pamphleteers, scratching scandal into cheap paper by candlelight, each rumour another dagger in the monarchy's heart. Picture yourself at a masked ball, chandeliers dripping wax, violins weaving through the night. A queen's glance lingers too long on a courtier, and suddenly a rumour is born. That single rumour travels down candlelit corridors, across gardens, and into Parisian taverns where commoners repeat it as though it were fact. By morning the queen is guilty in the court of public opinion. For queens, forbidden affairs, even whispered ones, were more dangerous than armies. The king might indulge in mistresses with little consequence, but a queen's suspected betrayal raised questions of heirs, legitimacy, and divine order. If the heir was in doubt, so was the kingdom. Historians still argue whether queens like Marguerite and Marie Antoinette truly strayed, or whether they were scapegoated by political enemies. What is certain is that scandal clung to their reputations like smoke, weakening the monarchy until revolution and rebellion struck. So as you stroll through those echoing halls, past portraits of serene women painted with stiff smiles, remember that behind every brushstroke lay storms of rumour. For French queens, a single whisper of a forbidden affair could topple not only reputations, but the very foundations of a dynasty. You might not picture Florence with its domes and marble plazas as a city run on bedroom whispers, but the Medici family proved otherwise. Tonight, you drift through the narrow stone alleys of Renaissance Florence, where oil lamps glow against frescoed walls, the Arno River murmurs in the distance, and palaces loom with both splendour and shadow. Behind carved wooden doors, the Medici, bankers turned rulers, wove power not only with gold but with forbidden affairs that stoked rivalries deadlier than any sword. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Cosimo de' Medici and his descendants cemented their dynasty through strategic marriages, yet their affairs often spilled into public scandal. Giuliano de' Medici, for example, was rumoured to have been entangled in several forbidden romances before his assassination during the Pazzi conspiracy in 1478. That conspiracy, which erupted in Florence's cathedral during Mass, wasn't sparked by love alone, but whispers of Medici affairs only added fuel to rival families' hatred. A quirky tidbit? Lorenzo the Magnificent, patron of Michelangelo and Botticelli, was accused of orchestrating elaborate masquerades where masked guests danced, flirted, and occasionally slipped away into the shadows for clandestine meetings. Some rivals swore these artistic festivals were covers for debauchery. Historians still argue whether they were truly scandalous or just typical Florentine flair exaggerated by jealous rivals. Now imagine yourself in a Medici palazzo, painted ceilings depicting mythic gods, courtyards scented with citrus, and in one corner a nobleman whispering too closely to a married lady. A servant carrying wine tries not to look, but everyone knows this could mean a duel by dawn. Affairs here weren't private indulgences, they were sparks tossed into a city already stacked with political kindling. The Medici used these affairs both as weapons and vulnerabilities. A rival family might expose a scandal to humiliate them, or, conversely, the Medici might blackmail others for their own indiscretions. Love and lust became currencies in Florence's intricate banking of power. And then there's Catherine de' Medici, who later carried her family's shadowy reputation into the French court as queen. Accusations of poison, plots, and scandal swirled around her like perfume, much of it linked to whispered rumours about her manipulation of lovers and courtiers. Whether or not she personally indulged, the Medici brand of intertwining politics with forbidden intimacy followed her across the Alps. Picture the flicker of a Florentine lantern, the soft strum of a lute from a street below, and above it all, voices low with gossip. Did you hear about Giuliano? About Lorenzo? Those murmurs weren't idle. They could turn into assassinations in cathedrals, riots in the piazza, and sudden disappearances of inconvenient lovers. Historians still argue whether the Medici were truly reckless in love or simply victims of rivals who weaponized rumor. But one thing is certain. In Florence, affairs weren't merely personal. They were part of the Renaissance's bloodsport of politics, waged as fiercely with passion as with pikes. So as you wander those Florentine streets tonight, let the glow of the Duomo's lantern fade into the background, while you listen for the secrets that once swirled in courtyards and palaces. secrets of forbidden loves that nearly undid the Medici legacy. You might think the fall of the Romanovs came only from revolutions, rifles, and Bolshevik banners, but behind the thunder of history were also whispers of affairs that cracked the dynasty's fragile image. Tonight, you wander through the Winter Palace in its twilight years, corridors lined with gold leaf and Fabergé eggs glimmering under lamplight, yet the grandeur feels brittle, as though even the chandeliers are waiting to shatter. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra tried to project an image of holy family life, but their court became infamous for rumors that the Empress had grown too close to Grigory Rasputin, the mystic monk with piercing eyes and an aura of danger. Historians still argue whether Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin was ever romantic. The evidence suggests it was spiritual rather than physical, but the mere possibility of a forbidden affair poisoned the monarchy's credibility. A quirky tidbit? Rasputin was so controversial that cartoons circulated in St. Petersburg depicting him lounging half-naked beside the Empress, surrounded by suggestive symbols. They were essentially imperial memes, spread by pamphleteers who understood that scandal travelled faster than truth. Imagine sipping tea in a smoky Petersburg cafe while someone slides one of these drawings across the table. Your eyebrows would shoot up, and suddenly the monarchy would seem like a farce. The problem was perception. Alexandra relied heavily on Rasputin's advice, especially because of his supposed ability to ease the haemophilia of her son, Alexei. But in a society already suspicious of German influence, Alexandra was born a German princess, rumors of forbidden intimacy with a peasant mystic were toxic. Nobles muttered in corridors, ministers exchanged knowing glances, and the public's faith in the dynasty dissolved like sugar in hot tea. And Rasputin wasn't the only shadow. Other Romanovs, too, became notorious for their passions. Grand duchesses whispered about in diaries, princes gambling away fortunes in Paris with mistresses on their arms. It all painted a dynasty out of touch, drowning in luxuries and scandals, while the empire itself starved. Picture yourself outside the Alexander Palace on a snowy night. The frost glitters on the ground, and inside a faint glow spills from the Empress's private chapel. People murmur, "She is with Rasputin again." Whether true or false, the damage is already done. Soldiers at the front read the same rumors, peasants in villages hear them, and suddenly the monarchy no longer feels sacred, but sordid. Historians still argue whether the Romanovs could have survived had Rasputin never entered the picture, or whether revolution was inevitable. What's undeniable is that the whispers of forbidden affairs, real or fabricated, became one more crack in the ice, until the whole imperial edifice plunged into freezing waters. So as you linger here, listening to the faint creak of frozen branches outside the palace walls, remember, sometimes empires collapse not only because of guns and hunger, but because of murmurs in the dark, stories of affairs that made kings and queens seem human, and therefore fatally vulnerable. You might expect the vast Persian Empire to be remembered only for its armies and palaces, but behind the grandeur of Persepolis and Susa lay scandals that curled through the royal courts like smoke from a brazier. Tonight you step softly into a throne room lined with polished columns, reliefs carved with processions of tribute-bearers, and a throne that towers on a platform of gold. The empire looks unshakable, but listen closer and you'll hear the murmurs of forbidden affairs that made even mighty kings falter. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Xerxes the same king who marched against Greece in the early 5th century BCE, became infamous for a scandal involving his brother's wife. Ancient sources claim that Xerxes fell in love with her, pursued her shamelessly, and when rebuffed, shifted his affection to her daughter instead. Whether true or embroidered by hostile historians, the story paints a picture of an emperor whose personal desires threatened to fracture loyalty within his own family. A quirky tidbit? Greek playwrights loved to exaggerate Persian scandals for dramatic effect, turning court intrigues into moral cautionary tales. One popular rumor claimed Persian queens bathed daily in donkey's milk to preserve their youth. Imagine the gossip. Yes, the empire runs on tribute from 20 satrapies and also a lot of dairy. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect truth or pure Greek propaganda meant to depict Persians as decadent and unfit to rule. But even Persian chroniclers admitted that royal affairs could ignite crises. In the harem, where dozens of wives and concubines competed for the Shah's attention, every whisper of favoritism had political consequences. A favored queen could elevate her sons to positions of power, while a slighted one might push her relatives into rebellion. Imagine standing in a perfumed courtyard, tiled fountains splashing softly while veiled women glanced daggers at one another, each fearing that the next embrace could decide the empire's succession. The Achaemenid kings projected divine authority, yet their humanity showed in these scandals. Succession disputes often began not with armies, but with jealousy in the royal household. Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, saw his court splinter as nobles whispered about his consort's rumoured indiscretions. When Alexander the Great later conquered Persia, Greek chroniclers gleefully painted the Persian royals as undone not by military might alone, but by moral weakness and romantic folly. Historians still argue, were these forbidden affairs genuine, or were they narrative tools used by rivals to discredit Persia's grandeur? Either way, the legacy stuck. Even today, when you picture Xerxes, perhaps you recall not his vast armies, but the rumour of his scandalous passion. So as you drift through those imagined palaces tonight, columns towering above, mosaics glittering with lapis and gold, remember that even in the heart of the ancient Persian Empire, the fate of kingdoms sometimes trembled not on battlefields, but in the quiet, dangerous chambers where forbidden love whispered its perilous song. You might not expect popes, those men robed in scarlet and white, crowned with the triple tiara, to ever feature in tales of forbidden affairs, but the papal bedchambers of Renaissance Rome were as notorious as any royal palace. Tonight you drift through the Vatican's echoing corridors, where frescoed ceilings soar above and incense curls in the dim light of 1,000 candles. The smell of old parchment, beeswax and lingering scandal clings to the air. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, openly acknowledged his children, including the infamous Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. His liaisons with mistresses shocked Christendom, but in Renaissance Italy, where politics often outweighed piety, the papacy itself became a dynastic tool. For many, Alexander's papal court was less a holy sanctuary and more a stage for lust, power, and intrigue. A quirky tidbit? Gossip claimed that Alexander once hosted a banquet of chestnuts, where courtesans danced naked among food and wine in the Vatican halls, with candles numbering in the hundreds. Historians still argue whether this event really occurred, or whether it was propaganda spread by enemies to slander the already infamous Borgias. Still, the mental image of cardinals pretending to solemnly bless grapes while side-eyeing a scandalous feast is unforgettable. And the Borgias weren't alone. Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope, fathered illegitimate daughters even while marching at the head of papal armies. His rivals mocked him as more concerned with heirs than with hymns. Meanwhile, Pope Paul III, who later convened the Council of Trent, began his career with open acknowledgement of his children, elevating them shamelessly into positions of influence. Picture yourself wandering the Vatican gardens at dusk, the air fragrant with orange blossoms. Behind a hedge, you overhear a low conversation. A cardinal pleading with a pope not about theology, but about which mistress should be granted a villa. Affairs here weren't just personal, they reshaped the map of Italy. Families like the Borgias and Farneses used romantic entanglements to secure wealth, land and titles, blurring the line between church and monarchy. And it wasn't only men. Noblewomen linked to popes wielded enormous behind-the-scenes power. Rumours swirled about Julia Farnese, mistress of Alexander VI, who was nicknamed the Bride of Christ by snickering Romans. Her influence on papal decisions made courtiers grumble that sometimes Rome was governed less by the college of cardinals than by a woman's whispered advice. Historians still argue whether these scandals truly reflected corruption at its worst, or whether they were exaggerated by Protestant reformers eager to paint the Catholic Church as morally bankrupt. Either way, the tales of papal affairs fed into the wave of criticism that erupted into the Reformation, shaking Europe's faith in Rome's moral authority. So as you let your imagination drift through those candlelit chambers, frescoes glowing with holy scenes overhead, remember the irony. In the very heart of Christendom, forbidden affairs whispered as loudly as prayers, and the papal bedchambers themselves nearly unravelled the Church's claim to sanctity. You might expect the Spanish Habsburgs, those stiff, pious monarchs immortalized in portraits with solemn faces and elongated jaws, to be immune to the whispers of forbidden affairs. Yet beneath their layers of velvet and etiquette, scandals stirred that slowly eroded the dynasty's authority. Tonight you walk through the dim, echoing halls of El Escorial, the massive granite palace monastery outside Madrid, where cold stone absorbs every rumour, and even the flicker of a candle seems reluctant to illuminate the truth. The mainstream historical fact: King Philip II, the same ruler who launched the Spanish Armada, endured persistent gossip about his private life. Though remembered for his Catholic zeal, rumours of his attentions toward ladies at court circulated like wildfire, especially after the mysterious deaths of 2 of his 4 wives. His court, so rigid in ceremony, was paradoxically alive with suspicion that its king might not be as saintly as he appeared. Here's a quirky tidbit. Philip IV, his descendant, was far less discreet. By some estimates, he fathered over 30 illegitimate children. His ministers allegedly kept a ledger of his lovers, almost like an official registry of scandal. Historians still argue whether this bedchamber account book was exaggerated satire or an actual administrative nightmare. Either way, it painted Spain's monarchy less as divinely guided and more as dangerously distracted. Now imagine yourself in a Madrid salon around 1650. The air is thick with pipe smoke, nobles sip chocolate brought from the New World, and a sly courtier leans close. Did you hear who visited the king last night? One whispered name could alter a family's fortunes forever, raised into power by proximity or destroyed by jealousy. For the Spanish Habsburgs, forbidden affairs didn't just sully reputations, they threatened dynastic stability. When so many illegitimate heirs floated about, questions of succession grew murky. Whispers that this or that prince was not truly the king's child festered into political poison. Ambassadors from rival courts eagerly carried these rumours back to Paris, Vienna and London, spinning them into propaganda. And then there was Charles II, the dynasty's tragic finale, whose ill health and childlessness made succession a nightmare. Though not known for scandalous affairs himself, rumours about his mother, Mariana of Austria, and her alleged favourites filled the vacuum. Whispers that illegitimacy or adultery tainted the bloodline gave Spain's enemies all the excuse they needed to circle like vultures. Historians still argue whether these tales were baseless slander or reflections of genuine indiscretions hidden beneath layers of formality. Picture the court at midnight, a long gallery lit by silver candelabra, courtiers glancing nervously at each other, and in the shadows, servants trading gossip for coin. Every flick of a fan, every side glance carried more weight than decrees. The empire may have stretched across oceans, but its heart was fragile, pulsing to the rhythm of rumour. So when you think of the Spanish Habsburg decline, don't just picture empty treasuries or defeated armadas. Remember also the forbidden affairs, the illegitimate heirs, and the relentless gossip that gnawed away at a dynasty until it collapsed under the weight of its own whispers. You might not expect samurai, those armoured warriors sworn to codes of honour sharper than their blades, to be caught in the soft tangle of forbidden love. Yet in feudal Japan, behind sliding shoji doors and under the hush of tatami mats, romances bloomed that threatened not just reputations, but entire clans. Tonight you step into a Kyoto garden under the pale glow of lanterns. The scent of pine and plum blossoms hangs in the cool night air, and somewhere behind a bamboo screen, 2 voices murmur words they dare not speak aloud. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The samurai class lived under Bushido, the code of loyalty, discipline, and obedience. Marriages were arranged to secure alliances, not affection. But this rigidity meant that when forbidden affairs happened, they carried enormous weight. Samurai caught in scandal risked not only disgrace but ritual suicide to preserve honor. Historians still argue whether Bushido's strictness suppressed passion or whether it simply forced it deeper underground, into poems, letters, and stolen moments. A quirky tidbit? In Edo period Japan, love letters were sometimes written in the form of tanzaku, slender strips of decorated paper tied to a branch, like a wish at a shrine. Lovers used poetry laced with subtle imagery. Plum blossoms in late frost, moonlight slipping through reeds. Phrases that could mean friendship to outsiders but everything to those involved. Imagine being a retainer, tasked with burning one of these letters before it reached the wrong hands, your palms sweating, knowing the ink on the page might condemn your master. One of the most infamous cases was the story of Lady Hosokawa Gratia, who, though remembered more for her Christian faith and tragic death, lived in a world where noble women's reputations were constantly shadowed by suspicion. Even the faintest rumor of an affair could mark a family for disgrace, whether or not it was true. Rival clans eagerly weaponized whispers, just as European nobles did. Picture a samurai lord returning from campaign to find his household divided by rumor, a wife accused of looking too fondly at a retainer accused of secret visits. Lanterns flicker, swords gleam in the dark, and the stakes are not just broken hearts, but seppuku and vendetta. A single affair could transform into bloodshed that rippled across provinces. Even in kabuki theater, forbidden love was a favorite theme. Plays like The Love Suicides at Sonizaki dramatized lovers choosing death over dishonor, echoing the real pressures of society. You might sit cross-legged on a theater floor, fanning yourself, while on stage, two actors weep beneath a painted moon, reminding everyone that passion and honor were often irreconcilable. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect widespread realities or whether they were cautionary fables. But one thing is clear: the samurai world, for all its rigid armor and strict codes, was as vulnerable to the quiet power of love as any European palace. So as you listen to the rustle of bamboo and the soft pluck of a shamisen string drifting across the night, remember, even in Japan's age of iron discipline, forbidden affairs bloomed like cherry blossoms, brief, beautiful, and dangerous enough to shake entire clans. You might think harems were merely silken prisons, but in the Ottoman Empire they were crucibles of power, where affairs and favoritism could ignite wars of succession. Tonight you drift through the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, its courtyards tiled with blue Iznik patterns, the air thick with rosewater and coffee, and beyond an ornate bronze gate lies the Harem-i Humayun, the imperial harem, where whispers were sharper than scimitars. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The harem housed the sultan's wives, concubines, and female relatives, watched over by black eunuchs sworn to loyalty. Far from idle luxury, it was a political engine. The favored concubine, known as the Haseki Sultan, often wielded immense influence. Affairs or favoritism within these walls could elevate a woman's family to staggering heights, or doom them to exile. A quirky tidbit: the concubines were trained not only in etiquette and embroidery, but in poetry, music, and politics. It was said a single glance across the sofa, the harem's great hall, could alter destinies. Historians still argue whether many of the Sultan's romances were genuine passions or calculated maneuvers by ambitious families, placing daughters into the palace like chess pieces. One of the most famous stories is that of Roxolana, or Hurrem Sultan, the concubine who captivated Suleiman the Magnificent. Originally a slave of Ruthenian origin, she rose to become his legal wife, an almost unprecedented move in Ottoman tradition. Their love affair changed succession itself. Her son, Selim, was elevated, bypassing rivals. Nobles muttered that Suleiman was bewitched, while foreign ambassadors wrote home that an empire was being run from behind the lattice screens of the harem. Picture yourself standing in the privy chamber, its walls glitter with calligraphy, its cushions embroidered with gold thread. Behind one carved wooden screen, a concubine whispers to an attendant, plotting how to secure the Sultan's next visit. Outside, the Janissaries patrol, but even their loyalty is tested when rival mothers push their sons toward the throne. Affairs inside ripple outward until entire provinces quiver. And then there were darker tales, poisonings, strangulations, sudden disappearances blamed on jealous rivals. The harem wasn't merely a place of passion, but a battlefield fought with veils, lullabies and daggers hidden in cushions. A sultan's sigh in one chamber could mean death for another's child by dawn. Historians still argue whether the harem should be seen as a den of forbidden affairs or as a sophisticated political system cloaked in romance. What's certain is that the line between intimacy and policy was so blurred that a kiss could alter the course of Ottoman history. So as you wander Topkapi's lantern-lit corridors in your mind, hear the soft shuffle of slippers, smell the rose attar rising from silver bowls, and remember, behind those latticed windows, forbidden affairs were not simply stories of love, but the very heartbeat, and sometimes the downfall of an empire. You might think a royal affair could be hidden beneath silks and sermons, but in Stuart England, every whisper became a weapon. Tonight, you slip into Whitehall Palace, where the Thames laps softly against its banks outside, while inside, tapestries glow in torchlight, and courtiers tiptoe carefully, afraid their gossip might be overheard, or not overheard enough. For in the Stuart courts, scandal was a form of currency, and forbidden affairs often fanned the flames of civil war. Here's the mainstream historical fact. James the Famous, the first Stuart King of England, faced constant rumours about his favourites, young male courtiers to whom he granted extraordinary influence. Robert Carr and later George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, rose meteoric in rank, prompting whispers that royal affection went well beyond mentorship. Historians still argue whether these were purely political relationships or genuine romantic entanglements, but the perception of forbidden intimacy undermined James's authority. A quirky tidbit, pamphleteers nicknamed Villiers Steenie, supposedly because he was as beautiful as the Archangel Stephen. Imagine buying a cheap leaflet in a smoky London tavern and chuckling over caricatures of the king mooning after his handsome courtier while England's finances crumbled. Then came Charles I, James's son, whose marriage to the French Catholic Henrietta Maria was fraught from the start. Charles insisted she be given Catholic priests and servants at court, which made Protestant England hiss with suspicion. When rumours spread that the Queen entertained secret liaisons with courtiers, Parliament's distrust boiled hotter. The truth mattered less than the perception. A king ruled by his wife's heart was no king at all, or so his critics claimed. Picture yourself in the House of Commons in the 1640s, the air thick with tobacco smoke and fury. A member slams his fist and growls, "The Queen's bedchamber is the kingdom's downfall." Outside, Londoners mutter similar lines in alehouses. Forbidden affairs, real or rumoured, became proof that the monarchy was corrupt, weak, or foreign at heart. When civil war erupted, these whispers sharpened into propaganda. Parliamentarian pamphlets painted Henrietta Maria as a lascivious papist puppet master, while cavaliers swore she was a loyal queen maligned by enemies. Either way, her reputation was weaponized. The war ended with Charles executed, his blood on the scaffold staining not just his crown, but the credibility of royal marriages themselves. And even after the monarchy was restored under Charles II, scandal never ceased. Charles earned the nickname the Merry Monarch for his endless mistresses, Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille, each wielding influence in politics. Courtiers joked that Parliament ruled by day, and Charles's mistresses by night. The line was humorous, but the reality was destabilizing. Historians still argue whether these affairs truly caused political collapse or simply reflected deeper fractures. Yet it's clear that forbidden loves gave opponents ammunition, stoking the fires that consumed the Stuarts. So as you stand in Whitehall's shadow tonight, listening to the murmur of the Thames and the soft creak of wooden floors, remember, in Stuart England the king's embrace could prove as dangerous as any cannon, and a queen's rumoured glance could tip a nation into war. You might expect the Mughal emperors of India to live lives wrapped in marble and music, but behind the jewelled walls of their courts, forbidden passions often struck chords that rattled entire dynasties. Tonight, you step softly through the arches of Agra Fort, moonlight glinting on red sandstone, the Yamuna River flowing quietly below. Musicians strum sitars in a distant courtyard, the air rich with sandalwood and rosewater, but within these chambers the atmosphere is heavy because one secret glance could become a spark that unsettled an empire. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Emperor Akbar, known for his reforms and tolerance, faced his share of scandalous rumours. Though he officially practiced restraint, chronicles whisper about his numerous liaisons, some crossing religious boundaries. In a court where Hindu princesses, Persian noblewomen, and Rajput consorts mingled, even the perception of favouritism could stir unrest. Historians still argue whether Akbar's personal passions influenced his policy of religious harmony, or whether policy simply provided a cover for his romantic entanglements. A quirky tidbit: Akbar built the palace complex at Fatehpur Sikri with a curious architectural detail, separate pavilions for different queens and concubines, connected by covered walkways. Servants joked that the emperor needed good stamina just to rotate nightly visits. Whether affectionate exaggeration or truth, the design itself reveals how intimacy was woven into the architecture of empire. Later emperors were far less discreet. Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal in memory of Mumtaz Mahal, was consumed by grief when she died, but during her lifetime, court gossips accused him of indulging affairs with other women, despite his deep devotion. Meanwhile, Aurangzeb, remembered as austere and devout, imprisoned his father and let rumours swirl that his moral severity was a mask for personal failings. Imagine yourself walking through the Diwani Khas, the hall of private audience. Candles flicker against inlaid marble, courtiers bow low, but behind the curtains of the Zanana, women's quarters, the real intrigue hums. A prince's romance with a woman outside approved alliances could ignite factional rivalries. A queen's rumoured affection for a court musician could taint her son's claims to legitimacy. The stakes were high. The Mughal throne was never secure. It was seized, contested, fought for with armies of elephants and cannons. In such an environment, a single affair could become propaganda. Rivals whispered accusations not just to tarnish reputations but to justify rebellions. Why follow a Shah who dishonours the faith? Why serve a prince born of scandal? These murmurs travelled faster than caravans carried in bazaars from Lahore to Delhi. Historians still argue whether the Mughal decline was hastened by these private entanglements or whether the empire was doomed by larger economic strains. But it's undeniable that tales of forbidden affairs, real or imagined, played their part in eroding trust. So as you linger in the cool marble shadows of Agra tonight, listening to the faint trickle of fountains and the rustle of silk beyond carved screens, remember that the Mughal emperors ruled vast lands yet could be undone by the softest, most dangerous force of all: forbidden love crossing the lines of faith, family, and fate. You might expect the cold stone castles of Scandinavia to echo only with sagas of warriors and longships, but northern thrones trembled too at the sound of forbidden affairs. Tonight you drift through a candlelit hall in Stockholm's old Tre Kronor castle, where snow drifts outside against frozen windows, while inside the hearth crackles and courtiers lean closer, whispering scandal into their cups of spiced mead. In the icy kingdoms of the north, queens carried burdens heavier than furs. Their reputations, fragile as frost, could shatter an entire dynasty. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, sister of King George III of Britain, became infamous in the 18th century for her close relationship with Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's physician. King Christian VII suffered from mental illness, leaving a vacuum that Caroline and Struensee filled, politically and, according to rumour, romantically. Historians still argue whether Caroline's affair with Struensee was genuine passion or an exaggerated scandal, but its consequences were undeniable. A quirky tidbit? Caroline and Struensee were said to ride through Copenhagen together, disguised in plain clothes, scandalizing courtiers who thought queens should remain veiled in protocol. One tale even insists they danced barefoot at masquerades, a shocking breach of decorum in a court that prized rigid dignity. Whether true or gossip, these details painted their relationship as both passionate and reckless. The fallout was dramatic. Struensee, having gained enormous power as de facto ruler, was arrested and executed in 1772, his body torn apart in a gruesome public spectacle. Caroline was exiled, torn from her children, and banished to Celle in Hanover, where she died at just 23. The Danish crown never recovered its dignity fully, the memory of the scandal lingering like smoke after a fire. But Scandinavia's royal affairs stretch further back. Medieval sagas are littered with queens accused of betraying their kings. In Norway, Queen Gunhild, wife of Eirik Bloodaxe, was described as a sorceress who seduced and manipulated men to secure her son's succession. Historians still argue whether she was truly villainous or whether saga writers simply demonized powerful women with the language of forbidden love. Picture yourself in a snowy courtyard, your breath fogging in the air as gossip spreads like wildfire. The queen has taken a lover. The words are sharp enough to cut through furs. For northern courts, where legitimacy was already fragile, such rumours could spark rebellions as easily as any sword clash. And even in Sweden, Queen Christina, who famously abdicated in 1654, faced whispers about her close attachments to both male and female courtiers. Was she eccentric, ascetic, or secretly scandalous? Historians still argue, and her gender-defying life only fuels speculation. So as you let the Nordic winter wind whistle past the castle walls in your imagination, remember, even here, in lands of sagas and snow, the heat of forbidden affairs thawed thrones and left dynasties trembling. You might expect the later Bourbon kings of France to have learned discretion after centuries of scandal, but in truth they carried on with the same reckless abandon, as if Versailles itself thrived on whispers. Tonight you drift once more into that gilded palace, its mirrors reflecting torchlight into endless copies, its marble floors echoing with the shuffle of slippers. But this is not Louis XIV's golden century. It is the twilight of the Bourbons, when affairs were less gilded fantasy and more corrosive reality. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Louis XIV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, filled his court with mistresses so openly that his reputation darkened from Louis the Beloved to Louis the Well-Beloved with a sarcastic edge. His official favourite, Madame de Pompadour, wielded enormous cultural and political influence. Later, Madame du Barry, a woman of far humbler origins, became his companion, shocking courtiers who believed the king had debased his crown by elevating someone from the streets. Historians still argue whether Louis's indulgences distracted him fatally from looming crises that would culminate in revolution. A quirky tidbit? Louis XV built a private retreat on the grounds of Versailles, the Parc aux Cerfs, where he secretly housed a rotating group of mistresses. Think of it as history's most scandalous bachelor pad disguised under royal prerogative. For courtiers, the existence of this hidden enclave was both an open secret and a constant source of snide commentary. Now picture yourself in a salon at Versailles in the 1760s. Courtiers sip chocolate and murmur bitterly. While the king dallies, the treasury empties. Every smirk, every flutter of a fan carries the weight of contempt. For a monarchy that claimed divine right, the spectacle of forbidden affairs cheapened its mystique. Then came Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Though Louis XVI himself was not known for affairs, he was awkwardly faithful. Marie Antoinette was surrounded by rumours. The most notorious, the diamond necklace affair, painted her as vain, extravagant, and guided by secret lovers. The scandal was false, but the damage was real. Pamphlets flooded Paris, many portraying her as entangled with courtiers or foreign agents, her bed a symbol of France's decline. Imagine a Parisian print shop, presses thudding late into the night, spitting out yet another cartoon of the Queen in compromising positions. Historians still argue whether these rumours were deliberate revolutionary propaganda or simply the inevitable gossip of a disillusioned public. Either way, they turned a frivolous court into the symbol of national rot. And when revolution came, Versailles' gilded halls seemed to echo with the ghosts of whispered affairs. Marie Antoinette, led to the guillotine, was less queen and more caricature, undone by a lifetime of scandal that clung to her, whether deserved or not. So as you stand in the hall of mirrors, the chandeliers swaying gently above, remember, in the final Bourbon years, forbidden affairs were not just diversions. They were accelerants, fanning the flames that consumed a monarchy and left France forever changed. You might think Egypt's royal scandals ended with Cleopatra's dramatic curtain call, but even her successors could not escape the dangerous allure of forbidden affairs. Tonight you wander through the sun-baked ruins of Alexandria, the Mediterranean breeze carrying salt and the faint scent of dust. Marble columns lie toppled, but if you close your eyes you can almost hear the music of flutes and the shuffle of sandals on mosaic floors, where queens after Cleopatra fought the same battles of love and legitimacy. Here's the mainstream historical fact. After Cleopatra's death and Rome's annexation of Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty was finished, yet stories of forbidden affairs clung to Egypt like perfume to linen. Roman rulers who governed the province often took Egyptian mistresses, a practice that scandalized senators back in Rome. The memory of Cleopatra's entanglements with Caesar and Mark Antony haunted every rumor, as if Egypt itself had become synonymous with dangerous love. A quirky tidbit? In Roman gossip, Alexandria was painted as a city of excess, where officials were more likely to lose themselves in affairs with dancers and priestesses than in governing. One satirist joked that Roman administrators sent to Egypt came back with more eyeliner than tax revenue. Historians still argue whether this was pure slander or whether Alexandria truly became a haven for indulgence under Roman rule. Later, when Egypt became part of the Byzantine world, whispers persisted. Empresses connected to Alexandria faced accusations of exotic affairs, their reputations tinged with Cleopatra's lingering shadow. Even centuries on, the archetype of the Egyptian queen, undone by love and scandal, refused to fade. Imagine yourself at a banquet in Alexandria during the early Roman Empire. Oil lamps glow, bronze platters overflow with figs and honey cakes, and somewhere at the head table, a Roman governor leans a little too close to a local priestess of Isis. Courtiers notice, servants whisper, and by dawn the rumor will sail across the Mediterranean faster than any galley. And in the centuries that followed, Egypt's queens and noblewomen became convenient scapegoats in political conflicts. If a rebellion flared, whispers spread that a queen had strayed. If a governor fell from power, rivals muttered about an affair. The pattern was as enduring as the Nile's flood. Personal intimacy twisted into public danger. Historians still argue whether these later tales were true or whether they were echoes of Cleopatra's legend, repeated until they seemed inevitable. Yet the fact remains, Egypt, more than any other land, was tied to the idea that forbidden love could topple empires. So as you let the desert wind brush against your face, imagine the flicker of torches in Alexandrian palaces, shadows dancing on painted walls. Even after Cleopatra, the legacy of queens undone or empowered by affairs lingered, a reminder that in Egypt, passion and politics were forever entwined, and every whisper carried the weight of history. You might think modern monarchies wrapped in cameras and tabloids would learn from centuries of scandal, but the Windsor dynasty proved otherwise. Tonight you wander through Windsor Castle's long corridors where portraits of solemn kings stare down at you, as though silently begging the present generation not to repeat their mistakes. Yet history repeats itself, and forbidden affairs in the modern royal household nearly cracked the monarchy's carefully polished veneer. Here's the mainstream historical fact. In the 1930s, King Edward VIII abdicated his throne for Wallis Simpson, twice divorced American woman. Their affair was not only considered forbidden by the standards of the time, but politically catastrophic. A king choosing passion over duty shattered centuries of tradition. Parliament bristled, the church objected, and newspapers churned with barely contained scandal. Historians still argue whether Edward was simply in love, or whether his political sympathies with Germany made him untenable regardless. Either way, the affair shook the monarchy to its core. A quirky tidbit: British newspapers at first tiptoed around the affair, keeping it out of the headlines, but Americans gleefully published every detail. Imagine being a Londoner hearing rumours at your barber's chair, then sneaking off to read smuggled American magazines that shouted the truth your own press refused to print. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and the Windsors faced another storm. Prince Charles's troubled marriage to Princess Diana became a global spectacle. His long-standing affair with Camilla Parker Bowles turned into one of the most famous forbidden romances of the modern era. When tapes of intimate phone calls between Charles and Camilla leaked, the monarchy's image cracked like fine china. You can almost hear the world's collective gasp, followed by tabloid presses roaring to life. Diana herself admitted her heartbreak, and her own rumoured affairs only deepened the drama. Buckingham Palace, with its iron gates and stiff rituals, suddenly felt like the set of a soap opera playing out before millions. Affairs that in earlier centuries would have been whispered behind fans were now broadcast on television, replayed endlessly, dissected in headlines. And yet, even in modern times, the danger was real. Public trust in the monarchy wavered. In the 1990s, polls suggested more Britons favoured scaling down or even abolishing the monarchy than ever before. Historians still argue whether the monarchy survived because of Diana's enduring popularity, or despite the scandals that consumed her marriage. Picture yourself standing on the Mall outside Buckingham Palace in 1992, the Queen's annus horribilis. Crowds gather, newspapers flap in the wind, and behind the palace's tall windows, one family's forbidden affairs feel heavy enough to topple an institution centuries old. So as you drift into the present day, remember that even modern monarchies cannot escape the age-old pattern: forbidden loves, whispered scandals, and the eternal question of whether a crown can survive the pull of the human heart. You might expect revolts to be born only from hunger and taxes, but forbidden affairs often served as sparks that lit tinder-dry kingdoms. Tonight, you step into a medieval marketplace, the air thick with roasting chestnuts, the clink of coin purses, and the murmur of gossip. Somewhere above this bustling square, in a castle tower, a forbidden romance unfolds, and by the time the rumour trickles down to the cobblestones, rebellion is already brewing. Here's the mainstream historical fact. In 12th century France, Eleanor of Aquitaine shocked Europe with her bold love life. Married first to Louis VII of France, she annulled the union after a scandal-filled pilgrimage and soon wed Henry Plantagenet, who became Henry II of England. Their stormy marriage was riddled with infidelities on both sides. When Eleanor allegedly supported her sons in rebellion against Henry, fueled partly by resentment over his affairs, an entire kingdom convulsed. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's defiance stemmed from political strategy or personal fury at her husband's betrayals. A quirky tidbit: during that rebellion, troubadours, the medieval singer-songwriters, composed verses suggesting Eleanor encouraged her sons by mocking Henry's wandering affections. Imagine hearing a jaunty tune in a tavern only to realize it's basically medieval diss-track rap aimed at the king. But Eleanor's story wasn't unique. Across Europe, peasants often rose when they believed their rulers' morals had collapsed. Rumours that a queen had taken a lover or that a king's mistress was draining the treasury could trigger riots. In Paris, bread shortages coincided with anger at Marie Antoinette's rumoured affairs, making her an easy target for fury that boiled into revolution. In England, pamphlets about Charles II's mistresses stirred resentment among Puritans already angry about taxes. Picture yourself as a farmer hearing whispers by the village well, "The king beds another while our children starve." The words sting worse than hunger. Soon neighbours gather, fists clenching around pitchforks, and the gossip of a forbidden affair becomes the excuse for open revolt. In Russia, too, whispers of Catherine the Great's companions became convenient fuel for peasant uprisings. Rebel leaders like Pugachev exploited rumours of her scandalous affairs to paint her as corrupt, stoking fury that boiled across the steppes. Whether true or not, the tales gave the discontented a banner to rally under. Historians still argue whether affairs truly caused uprisings, or whether they merely served as the match to long-stacked grievances. Either way, scandal provided a language for anger, a story people could cling to when their world felt unjust. So as you stand in that medieval square tonight, hear the creak of carts, the shuffle of boots, and the rising pitch of gossip turning into chants. Forbidden affairs didn't just reshape palaces. They spilled into streets where revolts were born, proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in history was not the sword but the rumour of love gone astray. You might expect royal feasts to end with laughter and music, but in courts across Europe, the banquet table sometimes led straight to poisoned cups and jealous rivals. Tonight you linger in a candle-lit hall where goblets gleam, venison steams on silver platters, and yet everyone eyes their drink a little too carefully. In this world, forbidden affairs didn't always end with heartbreak, they often ended with assassination. Here's the mainstream historical fact. In 16th century France, the Valois court became infamous for intrigue tied to affairs. Catherine de' Medici, queen and later queen mother, was rumoured to keep poison hidden in jewelled rings. Her sons' courts were rife with accusations that lovers and mistresses whispered too closely and that rivals slipped powders into wine to remove inconvenient consorts. Historians still argue whether Catherine herself orchestrated poisonings or whether her enemies exaggerated her role in a smear campaign, a quirky tidbit. In Renaissance Italy, it was whispered that if you wanted to survive a banquet, you should bring your own spoon. Noble families like the Borgias were accused, sometimes fairly, sometimes not, of using arsenic so often that Borgia powder became a dark nickname for poison. Imagine sitting at dinner watching the Duke raise his goblet, wondering if this would be the last sip he'd ever take. Forbidden affairs were easy pretexts for murder. If a noblewoman strayed, her lover might conveniently fall ill after a feast. If a king favoured a mistress too much, rivals might arrange her accident in a hunting forest. Picture yourself as a servant carrying a jug of wine down a corridor, overhearing a courtier whisper. Add just enough to silence him. You'd grip that jug tighter, knowing one sip could topple not just a man, but an entire faction. In England, rumours swirled around Anne Boleyn's downfall. Officially, she was charged with adultery, affairs with multiple men, even her own brother, but many historians believe the charges were fabricated to justify her execution. Still, the narrative of a forbidden affair gave Henry VIII the excuse he needed to reach for the axe. In such moments, the line between jealousy, politics, and genuine romance blurred fatally. And beyond Europe, similar tales haunted other courts. In Mughal India, rivals accused concubines of slipping poison into sherbet to eliminate competitors. In the Ottoman harem, jealous mothers allegedly ordered rivals strangled with silken cords. Passion, jealousy, and murder swirled together like spiced wine poured too quickly into a cup. Historians still argue were these poisonings real, or simply the paranoid fantasies of courts that thrived on rumour. Either way, the fear was real enough that nobles carried tasters, antidotes, and charms against poison everywhere they went. So as you let the torches gutter low tonight, imagine the uneasy laughter at those feasts, every clink of goblets masking suspicion. Forbidden affairs didn't always fade into sighs and songs. They often left the sharp aftertaste of betrayal and the silent thud of a body collapsing beside the banquet table. You might expect succession to follow the clear path of bloodlines, but forbidden affairs made that path crooked, casting doubt over heirs and shaking thrones to their foundations. Tonight you step into a royal nursery, walls painted with saints, cradles rocking gently, and yet every cooing infant is surrounded not just by nurses but by whispers. Whose child is this, really? Here's the mainstream historical fact: questions of legitimacy plagued nearly every dynasty. In medieval England, the Wars of the Roses were fueled in part by doubts over Edward IV's legitimacy. Rumours spread that his mother, Cecily Neville, had taken a lover during her husband's absence, making Edward possibly a bastard. Historians still argue whether these whispers were Lancastrian propaganda or whether they reflected genuine doubts, but either way, the uncertainty made civil war inevitable. A quirky tidbit? In France, King Louis XIV was so paranoid about the legitimacy of heirs that he occasionally burst into the birthing chambers of noblewomen to confirm with his own eyes that babies were truly born to their mothers and not smuggled in from elsewhere. Imagine the Sun King himself barging in during labour, perfumed wig askew, muttering, "Just making sure." Affairs complicated succession everywhere. Henry II of France, despite his marriage to Catherine de' Medici, was hopelessly devoted to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine's children often felt overshadowed, and whispers of favouritism led some to speculate whether Diane manipulated dynastic plans. In Spain, Philip III's illegitimate offspring created factions at court, each child a potential rival, claimant should the main line falter. Picture yourself in a palace hallway clutching a ledger of family trees. Servants lean in, whispering, "That boy, he doesn't look like the king." A raised eyebrow, a resemblance to the wrong courtier, and suddenly succession spirals into crisis. Armies muster, not because of treaties broken, but because someone suspected a queen's embrace. Even in the Ottoman Empire, succession wars erupted when rumours claimed certain princes were sons of concubines favoured through illicit affairs. The harem became a battlefield of legitimacy, where mothers schemed to push their sons forward, sometimes whispering poison into the ears of sultans to cast doubt on rivals. And in modern times the same theme returned. In 19th century Britain, Queen Victoria's son Edward VII was dogged by gossip that his father, Prince Albert, was not truly his sire, though historians dismiss it as unfounded. Still, the rumour shows how easily forbidden affair whispers could cling to heirs, even in an age of newspapers and trains. Historians still argue whether illegitimacy claims were ever sincerely believed or merely convenient weapons for ambitious nobles. But the pattern remains. A dynasty's fate rested less on its armies than on whether people believed a child was born of sacred union or forbidden affair. So as you let the cradle creak softly in your imagination, picture the shadows leaning over it, nobles, rivals, gossips, all asking the same dangerous question. Whose blood flows in the heir's veins? For kingdoms rose or fell on that single uncertainty. You might expect the echoes of forbidden affairs to fade with the centuries, but they linger in songs, paintings, and stories that keep scandal alive long after the lovers themselves are dust. Tonight, you drift through a gallery of memory, walls hung with portraits, pages of ballads fluttering in the wind, and murals glowing faintly in candlelight. These are not just works of art, they are monuments to affairs so shocking that no dynasty, no matter how determined, could erase them. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Court poets and chroniclers often immortalized forbidden romances, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with venom. The affair of Antony and Cleopatra, for example, lived on not just in Roman histories but in Shakespeare's tragedy, shaping how we remember them far more than their politics ever could. Their passion became myth, even if their empires crumbled. Historians still argue whether this literary lens distorts reality or whether it preserves a truth deeper than facts, that love itself can alter history's course. A quirky tidbit? In Renaissance France, pamphlets depicting queens accused of affairs sold faster than prayer books. Artists sketched caricatures of Marie Antoinette with imagined lovers, sometimes including half the court in bawdy cartoons. These prints became so popular that collectors treated them like trading cards, scandal as entertainment centuries before tabloids. Artistic memory reshaped reputations. Anne Boleyn, condemned in her own time as adulteress, later emerged in novels and plays as a tragic heroine undone by slander. Catherine the Great, mocked in salacious rumour, became both symbol of female empowerment and punchline in centuries of dirty jokes. You can almost hear the hushed laughter in taverns, the lute-strummed ballads sung by travelling minstrels, the queen who loved too well. And not just in Europe. In Japan, the tale of doomed lovers inspired kabuki plays that drew tears from audiences, retelling scandals of samurai consorts again and again. In the Middle East, whispered romances of caliphs and poets survived as legends woven into calligraphy and verse. Forbidden affairs became cultural currency, carried across generations like heirlooms of shame and fascination. Picture yourself in a medieval tavern, a minstrel strumming as the fire crackles. His song mocks a duke's affair from 50 years before, and the crowd roars with laughter, tankards sloshing. For the common people, scandal was both entertainment and a form of revenge against the untouchable elite. Historians still argue, do these retellings preserve history, or do they bury it under layers of exaggeration? Yet their persistence proves something undeniable. People never forgot. Affairs that nearly destroyed kingdoms became immortal precisely because they were retold, repainted, and replayed until the line between fact and fable blurred. So as you wander this gallery of memory tonight, feel the weight of those stories. Affairs fade, dynasties collapse, but scandal, scandal lives forever, shimmering in ink, melody, and brushstroke. You might expect time to bury these scandals under dust and silence, but the truth is that forbidden affairs never really leave history. They linger like perfume in old velvet, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Tonight you drift through a quiet corridor where the portraits of kings and queens stare down with solemn eyes. Their lips are painted shut, but you can almost hear the whispers still, affairs that shook empires, kisses that toppled crowns, secrets that nearly unstitched the fabric of kingdoms. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Nearly every monarchy, whether in Europe, Asia, or beyond, was reshaped at some point by rumours of love that strayed beyond duty. From Cleopatra's alliances with Rome to Charles and Camilla in Britain, the pattern repeats endlessly. The human heart, restless and unpredictable, slips past palace guards as easily as it slips past history's attempts to restrain it. A quirky tidbit? In Victorian England, collectors of royal scandal pamphlets bound them into volumes, almost like family Bibles of gossip. Imagine turning fragile pages by candlelight, the margins filled with doodles and snide notes, as if generations wanted to keep the memory of forbidden loves alive, just for the thrill. Historians still argue whether these records preserve genuine truths or simply our appetite for drama. But in the end, as you lean back and let the candle burn low, the lesson is softer than the scandals themselves. Affairs may have sparked wars, rebellions and downfalls, but they also remind us that monarchs, those gilded figures on thrones, were only human. They laughed nervously, wrote embarrassing love letters, made reckless choices, and sometimes gambled entire kingdoms for a touch of warmth in the night. Now the chandeliers fade in your imagination, the great halls fall silent, and the echo of footsteps dies away. The palace doors close, leaving you outside in the cool night air, under a sky strewn with stars that have seen every scandal before. The whispers quiet, the rumours settle like dust, and all that remains is the calm certainty that history, like love, is endlessly complicated, endlessly human. So, breathe deeply, let the cool night wind brush against your cheek, and feel your eyelids grow heavy. The scandals are long past, the kingdoms have fallen, and the fires of forbidden love are only embers now, glowing faintly in the stories we retell. Let yourself drift, carried gently by that thought. No daggers, no poison cups, no riots, just silence, stars, and the soft hum of time, smoothing out even the roughest scandals. Rest easy, knowing the kings and queens of history faced the same restless hearts as we do, and that their forbidden affairs, though once perilous, are now nothing more than lullabies of the past. And now, as we leave behind the echoing chambers of palaces and the sighs of forbidden lovers, let the stories soften. Imagine the torches of history dimming one by one until only a single candle flickers gently in the quiet. The air cools, the marble floors fade, and the weight of crowns and scandals slips away. Your breathing slows. You are no longer wandering through gilded courts or shadowed gardens. You are simply here, in this moment, resting. The voices of queens and kings have hushed, their intrigues dissolving into the stillness of night. Their passions, once sharp as daggers, are now nothing more than distant murmurs softened by centuries, smoothed into stories we tell for comfort more than for warning. Allow the rhythm of time to lull you, steady as waves on a shore. The rise and fall of empires, the scandals and rebellions, the secret letters and poisoned cups, all are carried far away, leaving only the gentle hush of the present. You can almost hear it now, the soft hum of history itself, a low murmur that soothes instead of stirs. Let your shoulders relax. Let the heaviness of the day sink into the mattress beneath you. The eyes of history no longer watch, they close with you. The weight of kingdoms, the dangers of scandal, the restless hearts of monarchs, all of it drifts beyond reach. Now there is only quiet, only calm, only the deep, slow tide of sleep waiting to carry you. Allow yourself to let go, to follow where it leads, into dreams soft as silk and safe as stone walls long crumbled. And with that we close the doors of history tonight. Sweet dreams.